amygdala, for instance, which is your fear button in the brain, because quite honestly, defending yourself is the bottom line for everyone. It's survival. And the rational brain, as I said, only 100,000 years old. It does not enjoy first mover advantage. Pun intended, conscious thought is an afterthought in how people make decisions.
They found this out actually with remote viewing, that people actually make a lot of their decisions from the subconscious, and that the subconscious is often the key to everything, finding out everything. It has access to everything. The fMRI, explain to the public what it is.
The fMRI is actually tracking blood flow in the brain. It is getting better and better. When I started my company in 98, you had about a 6-second gap. It means that you are placed inside a machine like a tube, and it is, reading that blood flow in the brain. They've now brought it down so it's only about 1 or 2 seconds off in timing. And it is able to map and look inside the brain, and it's most known from these color charts where you can see what parts of the brain are activating. Now, it's a fascinating tool, but from a daily business practice, it is not very practical. It's expensive, and you are potentially claustrophobically shoved inside this tube. It's hard to do a question and answer session. So we use a tool called facial coding, which goes back to Charles Darwin, and it's recognition that in the face you reflect and communicate your emotions, and it's the best vehicle for doing that. But the brain scans have been instrumental in helping to document how important emotions are to how people respond and react to the world.
I thought that was interesting that the responses come 8 seconds after something's been shown to people in the brain.
And that's on average, and that's the problem, because it could be quicker or slower, and so you don't have real-time data. The face is the only place in the body where the muscles attach right to the skin. So it is quick, real-time data without having to artificially put sensors on people or shove them inside tubes or anything like that. We are all facial coders. That's why we want the in-person meeting with our boss to know where we really stand in life. But it's a way, what I really find it's valuable for in the end is it's a way to track and understand people's emotional response, where they buy in, because I think advertising, market research has been utterly stuck in the Descartes mode of rationally asking people. And if you have never been lied to in life, congratulations. And if you stick with that route, there are things that people won't tell you. But most fascinating, I think there are things that people can't tell you, because we now know how much of it's below the surface of the water, how much of it's subconscious.
You said everyone is a facial coder. Explain to the audience what a facial coder is.
A facial coder means that you, in a conversation, all of us instinctively will take in the facial muscle activity of the other person to use it to pick up signals of basically how do you stand with someone. LBJ, the former president, said if you can't walk into the room and know who's with you and who's against you, you ain't worth spit as a politician.
That's astute.
Now, in Blink by Malcolm Gladwell, they use this on marriage counseling. And they have found that a contempt expression where the corner of the mouth curls up in a sign of disrespect and superiority to the other party is the most reliable indicator that a marriage will fail. And I think it's not a big stretch of imagination in business terms to say, you know what? The brand consumer is a relationship. And people's value system and their sense of whether or not they trust you and respect you is the fundamental glue that makes that work. And so you don't want to take them to a contempt level. So facial coding means that we are, in my company, as a daily practice, there's 43 muscles in the face. There are 23 combinations of muscle activity that correspond to 7 different emotions that go across cultures. We're talking happiness, surprise, anger, fear, sadness, disgust, and contempt. And the killer thing that Charles Darwin first came to realize, even a person born blind has the same facial expressions as you or I.
That's interesting.
It's not socialized, It's not learned, it's hardwired into the brain. A child by 9 months of age has all the core emotions on their face.
That's fascinating. Wow.
It is fascinating. When I read that, quite honestly, I said, my God, this is the tool I'll be using for the rest of my life. And I was so excited that I went rollerblading along the beach in San Diego for the next 2 hours because I couldn't believe it.
What has been the biggest challenge bringing this information to businesses? What has been the greatest challenge of people receiving this properly?
Cognitive dissonance. because it fundamentally challenges their notion that we are in control of our lives, that we understand our own thought process, and that everything that we've ever done before is potentially imperiled. I was meeting with a major Fortune 100 company, and I was with two researchers. One person got where I was coming from, was fascinated, was very enthusiastic. The other person was scared to death, and that person said, "If you're right, Dan, everything in my files is wrong." And my response was, in all honesty, that may well be true, because we now have a fundamentally different understanding of how people take in the world and make decisions. And so what I said to her was, no fault of yours. Until I showed up, you worked with the tools as best you can. But going forward, you now know there's a new alternative and a new paradigm. And if you don't seize the opportunity, then that falls on your shoulders going forward.
How would this relate, for example, in people buying cars? Sometimes people are very price sensitive, et cetera, but I've seen people buy things they absolutely couldn't afford because they like the salesperson.
Yeah, well, I mean, definitely the salesperson is a factor. I had a former brother-in-law who was a salesperson, and he was just a fundamentally good person, and he drove the other salespeople crazy because people would come into the store and they would ask for Rolf, and they would just blew right past any other salesperson because they wanted somebody who wasn't going to spin them and push them into a sale. So you start with trust, but once we move on to the car, one of the really fascinating things about price is that a price just has to be heard to be pigeonholed. You know, too high, can't afford it, too low, cheap, good deal. But it's value over time that really drives a business and allows it to succeed. In other words, we take in all these sensory impressions, mostly subconsciously, and we're forming clues and a picture of, do we think this car works well? That's why things like, you know, how does it sound when you close the door? You know, does it have a hollow sound to it? Does it feel good to you? Yes, you know, even things like the color of the paint job. I mean, there are people who won't buy a car in, you know, these 19 colors, but these 3 are the ones that are possibilities. There is a whole wealth of ways in which we are taking in and appraising that car in our purchase, and we may not be aware of it, but together they form that picture of what we're willing to do. And I think the funny thing is that the companies think it's all these extra gigaws of horsepower and so on. People have a really hard time assessing most of those things. It's the tangible things that we can take in and work with. And I think the companies should orient themselves to playing to the tangible where human beings reside, because otherwise you're just trying to sell the engineers, and there aren't enough of those to be a major car company.
With regard to the facial coding work that you do you use a computer to do this?
No one has automated it to date. Even the CIA and the FBI who use facial coding, everyone's had to do it on a manual basis. It takes us about 5 to 7 minutes to do every 30 seconds of video, including having to baseline the person. As George Orwell said, by the age of 50, a man is the face he deserves. So some people are happy campers, some people are grouches. You have to take that into account. The automation's going to come on. But, you know, it's going to come by degrees because, you know, say, for instance, someone's in a test and they wrinkle their nose. Well, what happens if they sneeze 2 seconds later? You have to recognize that that probably was the first premonition of the sneeze, not a disgust reaction. So computers are going to have to be sensitive to context, and I think it will come on, but it's just not there yet.
So with regard to selling into the emotional realm and understanding that clients are experiencing everything on an emotional realm, what does this mean in terms of functioning differently for salespeople and business organizations?
Well, I'm going to start with business organizations because one of the things I find most amazing is just how important a leader really is. There are studies out there to show that a chimpanzee will forego food in the jungle for an uninterrupted view of the leader. In other words, they want to know the leader of the pack's emotional temperament at any given moment because that signals whether they're safe or not safe and whether there's enjoyment there or not enjoyment. And there are other studies out there that now show that a CEO can change the performance level of a company by up to 30% and can be responsible for 50% of the corporate climate, so to speak, the emotional climate within a company. So it's infinitely amusing to me when they announce some business plan where they're going to buy XYZ company, and they're hoping for a 3 or 5% lift in sales based